We've been in the past and I want to move to the future, which is a Thrutopia, which is, utopia is always produced by someone else's dystopia, that both function, create the other. And so I think the Thrutopia is that collaboration. It's less about a climactic state and it's more about a participatory event that people are constantly working on. And so I want you to talk about how you envision Thrutopia, what kind of work can be produced by it, how it comes to be.
Brilliant question. So yes, and I just want to say I hadn't heard before that dystopia creating utopia and vice versa. I love that. And this is a participatory event. That's the thing. It has to be. So if we come from my really basic concept that no problem is solved from the mindset that created it, I didn't make that up, but it's one of my founding concepts for this. And we need to start exactly where we are. And we need to unpick what's really not working. So for me, what's really not working is governance structures, economic models, and estimations of value and worth. And then how could we change those absent violent revolution? I'm absolutely clear that this needs to be peaceful.
Yeah.
So then what can we do? And what I discovered, partly, I wouldn't have been able to write the Thrutopian book if I hadn't been running the podcast for the last 3 years. There are so many people right at the leading edge of change. There are so many theories of how we can do this. There's so many social technologies being evolved and tested in real time of how can we help people to respond differently at the same time as our social media technologies, by default or design, are driving us into more and more dopamine-based outgroups. Our tribalism is now at the point where it is threatening the foundations of our democracy. How do we change that? And how do we bring people together to find a common vision, even to accept that there might be a common vision? And then what does that common vision look like? And accepting the fact that those who gain most from the status quo are not going to relinquish their power readily. So I want to change the governance system. I think our current system of so-called democracy is not democratic and is not fit for purpose, probably hasn't been fit for purpose for a long time, but it's medieval. There's somebody, D.O. Wilson, I think, had said we've got, the main problem now is we've got Paleolithic emotions, medieval technologies, medieval institutions and the technologies of gods. And this is not a winning combination. So we need, how do we get out of our Paleolithic emotions? How do we get out of a world that is feeding us constant dopamine hits and into a world that creates serotonin mesh, as in neural mesh and social mesh, which is more long lasting? The problem with dopamine hits is that they're short term, they're linear, they end, and we keep trying to refeed them, and you never get the same hit you got the first time. Whereas a serotonin network mesh in our brain is self-supporting and grows and evolves and becomes stronger. So how do we move people? But the dopamine hits are still very addictive. That's what dopamine is. And when I was doing the thesis at Schumacher, I read somewhere someone did some paper, and the validation that we get when our guy, so let's say, suppose Boris Johnson had decided to run for the Tory leadership, his followers were getting huge dopamine hits from his return. Oh, our guy is right, equivalent to a line of cocaine.
Yeah.
And if he'd run and won, they would have got big lines of cocaine. And then you want that more, and you'll do whatever it takes to get it. The ends always justify the means. And this is, it would break us apart, but they wouldn't care because they were right and they're getting the dopamine hit. It's a very, very big reinforcer. So how do we shift people onto the very different reinforcement of connection and coherence and generosity and integration and all of the things that give us the serotonin hits that aren't as steep but are much more long-lasting and resilient? So really the research for that has been a lot of really quite deep research of what are people evolving as alternative governance and political models, and how do we make the transition from one to the other without having tanks on the streets? And then from that, what economic model could we use that isn't predicated on a predatory capitalist growth model, which is infinitely extractive and is not compatible with a living planet? So that all sounds a bit theoretical. I've got 181,000 words of how I think it works, but I only got us to the end of the first day after the general election that breaks everything apart in that 181,000 words. Book 2 is going to have to be, that was the building the movement to show that with the right movement we can create difference. And then I haven't started yet the next book, which will be, okay, this is the difference we can make, but as the old structure crumbles, there's going to be friction. There is going to be friction. But I think, I can't remember who it was, but there is some kind of famous aphorism about the old is falling apart, the new cannot yet arise, and that in the gap between is all possibility. But if we don't, I think we don't create visions of that possibility. We don't create visions of a future that we could imagine our grandchildren's grandchildren looking back on our time and going, yeah, they left it way too late. They were led by complete madmen in totally the wrong direction, but when it mattered, they turned around and they made good decisions for the benefit of everybody, not just their own tribe. And we are here because of them, and we are grateful. And I want that. I don't have grandchildren, but I want my partner's grandchildren's grandchildren to say that, not they fucked up so badly that we're living in deserts.
This seems to come back to your evidence-based storytelling and spirituality, which is, it's not just about the creative act, it's about what does it actually do? How does it operate in the world? How does it create actual change? And I think that's the storytelling that doesn't actually change the way people relate to each other and to their earth. For me, it's not urgent enough. The times are urgent. And another thing about your podcast, about Thrutopia, that I think is a really great model is you draw on different modalities. Like it's an ecology of practices that you're not gonna look to just one person, because we can't have a monotheistic mindset about how this is going to happen. So I think I want to end by asking, which are the ideas today that are most exciting to you? Like ideas, books, people you've talked to. Yeah.
Good question. So Daniel Schmachtenberger and his Consilience project, I go back to him a lot for leading edge ideas and for a framing of the multipolar nature of the problem and what he calls the third attractor. So he has a concept. So this is the idea of you spin a ball with a ball in it, and there will be a tendency for the place of the gravity for the ball to sink. And if you have a thing that has two polar opposites, the ball will go to one. The other, one of the poles is authoritarianism, and the other one is utter chaos. And he wants the third attractor, which is what I'm wanting, which is the way forward. So I find him quite inspiring for a framing of the concepts. Where I'm much more going for framings of ways through are things like the Regen Civics Alliance, from which Reiki Corden is a big feature in, and everything that branches out from there, who are people who are on the ground setting up eco-villages and communities and testing the social technologies of how do we take a bunch of people who think they all have kind of the same idea, but actually are probably quite disparate, and create a coherent community quite fast, because this has never been done in the history of humanity. There's an amazing book, which I recommend everybody reads, called The Dawn of Everything, by David Graeber and David Wengrow. Okay, if I'd read that before Boudica would probably have been different, but it didn't exist till this time last year. But throughout history, all of our cultures, as far as I can tell, all of our societies arose as communities of place, because basically your transport was muscles. You could walk or you could ride a horse. And for most of us, it was walking. Riding horses was not a common thing. And so you got on with the people around you because you had to, and partly because you were related to them and because you'd grown up with them. What we are doing now, because we've all moved around a lot, is how do we create that sense of cohesion, either in the place we happen to live by default, or by grouping together with a group of people that we think we have something in common with, and we want to create a community. And the history of the last 50 years is littered with idealistic communities that failed.
Yep.
And if you talk to the people, they failed because of alcohol or drugs or just a sheer incompatibility and a failure to reach consensus on decision making. And we don't have time. When I talk to the people who I think know, so Daniel Thorson is another of my real inspirations. He's host of the Emerge podcast, and he came onto the Thrutopia masterclass I ran recently. And in my naivety, I said, Daniel, so how long do you think we've got? Thinking he'd say something comforting like a decade. And he kind of looked for me and said, well, the people I'm really talking to, which is Schmachtenberger and Jamie Wheal and the like, they think 2.5 to 3 years.
Yeah.
Right. And I was just talking to somebody else who had been at a workshop in Berlin, and they said, okay, so they think the same. This is coming out of the latest IPCC report. That's 10 sections of 100 days. What are you going to do with your 10 times 100 days? And if you break it down into that, each one of those is an important movement towards something that will actually be resilient. And if we're going to build these communities, we have to build them while supply chains last, before it is impossible to get concrete or iron, while there is still food on the shelves, or we've set up enough that we can grow to feed not just the people growing it, but enough people in the surrounding area. And I don't want to end up sounding like a prepper, because I don't think that's what this is. This is about creating networks of communities that function in a way that is not dependent on a predatory capitalist structure that is falling apart. And being part of that transition, letting go of our obsession with money while still functioning in a world where you can't actually get food without money is hard. So even working out how we might do that in a way that feels generative is challenging. It's much harder to write Thrutopian stuff than to read between the lines of Tacitus and work out where he was lying, by quite a long shot. But having done all of that, it's given some of the skills to look at what's happening here and now and try and create. And I think there will be dozens of Thrutopian ways through. I ran the masterclass for 6 months with 100 or more writers, so that we would begin to seed out amongst writers the ideas. This wasn't about teaching you to write, it was about bringing in people who know about regenerative power or different governance models or different economic models or different food and agriculture models, so that the writers have the ideas, and then each of us will fit them together differently. But I think there will be a commonality of emotional literacy, connection to the land. It doesn't have to be spiritual, although I don't quite see how we get through it isn't, but that's because mine is. If you can think you can create a non-spiritual version, please feel free. And connection to other people that is reciprocal and generous, and that assumes the best of people and doesn't assume the worst of them. Taking things in good faith has got to become how we start to work, or we're finished, I think.
I find your sobriety remarkably comforting and refreshing. And that I think that utopias, and because they don't actually offer us a way through, can feel very destabilizing. So what can we do with this short amount of time? What can we do every single day? How can we just take the next right step?